Fred, you can start.
Merci, merci Viola. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. On laisse le temps à tout le monde.
Good morning, everybody. I'll just give a bit of time for everyone to come in and get connected. I'm delighted to introduce this session on the community of practice. This is the second one. There was a first meeting on remittances in Senegal with Edwin. And now we have Leleng Tonga, who is replacing Edwin. Leleng is the representative of the financing facility for remittances, le mécanisme de financement pour l'envoi de fonds au Sénégal, and he's going to be the moderator for this session. Over to you, Leleng. Thank you very much, Frédéric. Hello, everybody. Good morning. Today, I have the honor to moderate this session, which is really going to be very useful. It's going to help us to identify customers. So, as per the recent survey that we conducted in the National Remittance Network, we have worked along these lines and with Senfree as well. And we have John Symington, who is really an expert in identification of customers. He is also someone who is behind the toolkit. John Symington is behind this toolkit called Inclusive Integrated Toolkit. And John is going to share with us a presentation based on the work that Senfree has done within the framework of the identification of risk. So he is going to share a few lessons with us, lessons that have been learned in other countries and in other areas of research. So John Symington, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. It is always a pleasure to be able to have an opportunity to talk to people that have a everyday obligation and contribution to make in respect of AML, CFT, and financial integrity in general. Today's focus is particularly interested in where that articulates into the risk-based approach and inclusion. So I've got a presentation to share. Ms. Sibo, from your side, do you want to provide some introductory remarks?
Juste préciser que en dessous de l'écran, excuse-moi John, juste en dessous de l'écran, il y a un petit bouton.
Excuse me, John, I just want to say that there is a little button for interpretation at the bottom of the screen. You have the choice between listening to English or listening in French. You can choose your language as per your requirements. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much, Lélène. Thank you, John. I'm just going to say a few words by way of introduction on the program, the Remittance Access Initiative, before giving the floor to John. So this program has been conducted in 7 countries, including Senegal, Ghana, Gambia, Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, and Morocco. The purpose of this program is to improve access to remittances, especially for rural households and low-income households, in order to improve their living standards. And before I give the floor to John, I just want to give you an idea of the interventions that we have conducted in these 7 countries. We have worked with two service providers, remittance service providers, and the examples of interventions are on risk evaluation. We have observed that there is a lot of demand, and John will share some of the perspectives that are emerging, just like Lelaine mentioned. And we are also working on the system-generated receipts in order to solve the problems of illiteracy. We are also working on due diligence and simplified diligence, on digitization of identity databases in order to avoid any challenges related to identity. We have also developed these interventions with the help of service providers, jointly with them in these countries. In Senegal, we have contacted all of the service providers that were registered at the beginning of the program. We're working with two of them, Whistle Money being one of them. As to Mr. John Symington, he is an expert in risk assessment. He's a very active member of compliance across the world, and he works with financial institutions, regulators, organizers like FATF on compliance, on risk, and on inclusive integrity. And he has worked a lot with Senfree on this toolkit. And he is also a founding director of Compliance Institute of South Africa, and has developed practice of general practice of compliance that is accepted by Compliance Institute of South Africa, which is currently available. So now, without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to John, and John is going to guide us through this discussion today. Thank you very much. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Masiwa.
Yes, thank you very much. I just want to mention that, sorry, John, let me just finish this piece of advice. You were free to ask questions as and when you wish all along the presentation. Thank you very much. Over to you, John.
Thank you. I've got a very full presentation, so look forward to your questions as we go through this presentation. I will go through some of the slides quite quickly. Please feel free to ask your questions as I'm going through the presentation itself. I'm covering the risk-based approach in general. We're going to start looking at outcomes. So in other words, you need to achieve an outcome based on your vision of success for inclusive integrity. And we're going to then move into risk. What is it? How do you assess risk? And then a few comments to conclude around levels of assurance, or how you represent your proportionate responses relating to those risks. As Masiwa has indicated, we have a number of projects that have a nice practical application across institutions, and we have been able to engage so you can build a number of models that are helping the institutions that we spoke about. What it allows for is individual customer risk assessment. Over and above that, you need to understand your business context. So each product that an organization has, particularly remittances is our focus, and different corridors and different products may have different features, and those need to be assessed in relation to the delivery of the product to the client base I was talking about, taking into account the geographic attributes that may indicate that there's an element of risk or otherwise. So that's the backdrop. Very briefly, to provide some context, inclusive financial integrity is now a well-known concept. What it means is that financial integrity, anti-money laundering, the need to counter the financing of terrorism is not necessarily something that should be seen as a thing that is in conflict, or a thing that is not deeply integrated with financial integrity and financial inclusion being the opportunity to have proportionate responses to the risks I was talking about. And in many cases, practically, we've been able to engage with organizations and move along I guess it's a learning curve that takes organizations from an approach which is largely perception driven. In other words, your risk assessment is based on high level understandings of a number of people, not necessarily at the coalface sometimes, of the risks, taking into account those factors I was talking about. And we move them towards a more robust understanding, a data-driven outcome from that risk model we've developed and implemented. So your opportunity is to recognize, as is recognized in the international standards, the Financial Action Task Force recommendations as risk-based. It is something that explicitly requires that institutions understand their risks and then have proportionate responses to those risks. So the international drive is to develop an understanding of risk and then a proportionate responses to those risks. And we'll talk about the tools that we've used in implementing a risk-based approach or further developing the risk-based approach in a number of institutions. If there are any particular challenges of members of this audience, be happy to take questions now. And if there are any aspects that you have in your region or in your institution that you would like me to focus on, I'm happy to do that. Please feel free to ask the question in the chat or unmute, and I'll be happy to take your advice and focus on those particular challenges that you have. Let's start with the risk-based approach and position what the starting point is. What does success look like for your financial integrity program, anti-money laundering, obviously, and the countering of the financing of terrorism? And what is the framework you need? Now, I'm going to go through this reasonably quickly. Your starting point is, so what is needed? The risk-based approach is obviously now a requirement, and it is embedded in everything that the countries are responding to in the Financial Action Task International Standard Framework. Your first question is, so what does success look like? And as an institution, you will be positioning compliance as something that is a have to have or a want to have. The have to have is, so what do we do for due diligence, and what do we do so you don't necessarily get a fine? The outcome would be risk mitigation, and there are different risks, and we'll position those and then have a discussion about how you assess them and how you respond to them. So AML in the risk-based approach context is about what is it you're trying to achieve, and that is to mitigate the money laundering, terrorist financing, or even proliferation financing risk. In determining that strategic outlook, and hopefully some organizations in this call have done this, you need to determine what you're measuring within that. So your measures of success might be, you don't want to be fined, that's great. You would then need to understand your risk and respond to it appropriately. And your measure of success might be that you understand your risk appetite and your tolerances, and the risks are then appropriately assessed using data to produce a high level of assurance that your risks are mitigated or you understand what they are. In this kind of framework, it moves away from the traditional tick box approach, and you're moving to an outcomes context. And I won't talk long to this slide, but the financial action task 11 outcomes I've got, so if you can cast your eyes through this screen, you can see the financial action task outcomes. As you will be aware, it ranges from in recommendation 1 to the risk-based approach, through to prevention in immediate outcomes 10 and 11, which you'll be aware of, and that's prevention focused. The international standard is not meant to position compliance as something that is a yes or no answer. In a risk-based approach, you need to be able to accept risk. And from a compliance risk perspective, you might not want to accept a lot, but your money laundering risk and terrorist financing risk, which are separate risks, might have an element of risk, and you should be able to accept that. And you need a framework and a process, and the models we'll talk about provides the support for that, to be able to accept those risks. Yeah, so what is the context? The country level obligations are put into law. You will have sector context. So if you're a remittances service provider, you will have, and that's the focus of our project, you will have an understanding of what your organization needs to comply with and what you're trying to achieve. And this kind of community of practice is a really good platform to be able to have a conversation about what are the principles that should underpin a risk-based approach. One of the things I've often looked at is, so where do you find those principles? And if they do exist, are they relevant within a West Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa context? My view is the principles don't exist. They need to be built over and above the international standards. And there really is an opportunity to facilitate a discussion about how risk principles should underpin anti-money laundering and to the combating of financing of terror. Where do you start with that discussion? The Senfree and Alliance for Financial Inclusion, it's got quite a nice framework for thinking about the risk-based approach in general and the financial inclusion context in relation to financial integrity. So there's a publication which I would steer you towards. You can find it. It's a toolkit that is available, and in it has the strategic content and the responses that institutions might be wanting to position within the overall strategy and policy of a country. I'm happy to take questions on this, but I won't spend a lot of time on it because I want to get to the models themselves. I would like to finish in about 30 minutes time. So that is your backdrop. That's the framework within which to think about risk. Now, so what are the risks, and how do you position them, and how do you respond to them? Very often in institutions, and this has been our experience in respect of the institutions that we have provided some support to in developing their risk-based approaches, and in particular risk assessment. Money laundering risk, terrorist financing risk, and compliance risk, I often find that they are conflated into one risk. You find this money laundering / terrorist financing, or AML / CTF risk assessment, and then risk responses to that. So they're often conflated into one view of risk. They are nevertheless very, very separate risks and should be separately defined. So you should define money laundering risk. So the definition of money laundering is really easy to put into a compliance program. Money laundering risk, where do you find the definition? So it's not defined in the international standards, and it's often not defined in a country context. Do you need it? Definitely. It should be separately defined in frameworks, along with terrorist financing risk. It's a separate risk. And then compliance risk is a very closely related risk, but they're separate things. And until you separate those risks, quite often you'll find that institutions are in a legacy, largely checklist-driven compliance framework, and quite often you can have over-compliance because you have an over-reliance on documentation rather than an understanding of data and data points to develop an understanding of the risk and then have models or dynamic processes that can respond to those risks. So our approach has been to work on that risk definition context and can share some definitions with you. First up, money laundering risk is the risk that an organization can be abused for money laundering purposes. That's quite different to compliance risk. Compliance risk is the risk that you're going to be fined, and you can have fines and penalties. Terrorist financing risk is similar to money laundering risk. An organization can be abused for money laundering or terrorist financing purposes. So your ML and TF risk is the risk that the international standards and your country obligations have been put in place to address. You can see the definitions on the screen as I'm going through them. All of those in the middle of the screen: money laundering risk, terrorist financing risk, and proliferation financing risk are separate, should be defined separately, and should be assessed separately. Over and above that, your definition of compliance risk, you might want to assess the financial exclusion risk and then your illicit financial flows risk. Lastly, let me just go back to the slide. On the bottom right-hand side of the screen, you can see illicit financial flows. Each one of those risks is separate, and if you have a comprehensive risk-based approach, you would understand them separately and have a risk appetite specified in respect of each, and that's based on some understanding of your risk based on the models that we have spoken about, or your models if you already have them. The risk you need to understand at different levels, right? You would have features like product risk, delivery channel risk, client risk, geographic risk, other risk. Those will be taken in combination, and you can get a inherent risk understanding of the different aspects of your organization across those risks I've just spoken about. You have compliance measures in place from governance through to due diligence, and then you would be able to represent that you have a residual risk understanding, and that may be high, medium, or low. I know that your compliance risk needs to have a residual risk profile of low risk, but you could conceivably in an organization have a relatively high compliance risk with really low money laundering risk, so that not the same risks, and as I was saying, there's an opportunity to see them separately. And your risk classification would be very high through to low, or high, medium, and low. We normally recommend a 5-point scale because it gives you a more graduated opportunity to represent. You've got different risks and you can respond differently to every one of those risks. I've included very high because it's normally beyond your risk appetite. So high, medium, and low, if you've only got a 3-point scale, we would normally recommend thinking about a broader scale. You need a risk.
John.
Surely.
Hello. John, allow me to intervene. We will raise a couple of questions. Donc, je m'adresse plutôt à l'audience. Je pense que là,
now I turn to the audience because we received a pretty structured presentation of the framework, and I wanted to know whether members of the audience already had any questions or had any comments in order to provide more context and on how these risks are perceived, assessed, and what are the various challenges in the region and in Senegal in particular. If any participants want to share their experience or ask their own questions, this would be a good time to do that and would help John as well to contextualize and structure his own remarks when he delves into the more specific analysis of risk assessment for different organizations. So if you have any questions or comments at this point, that would help tailor the presentation. I just wanted to mention as well that the BCO is a part of this meeting, and that work is being done in terms of risk assessment. And so should you have any questions, any comments? Thank you. This would be a good time.
Okay, John, you could continue, please proceed.
Thank you. The more practical side of the presentation will be seen in the next few slides. You need a risk identification and assessment methodology in all of our institutions, and the rating of that would be anything from taking into account the factors we spoke about, understanding your risk mitigation, weighting certain factors in respect of their importance. Some aspects of the risk rating of a client or client's transactions or a client in respect of the corridors in which remittances are undertaken might be weighted differently in different contexts. So your model would be able to take into account those attributes relating to the factors and come to an answer that produces a level of confidence that you've understood your risk. So the models I'll show you are just examples, very, very high level examples of approaches that can be applied. And in the projects that Masiwa was talking about earlier, we've used these models and have been able to walk a journey with a number of institutions to have a robust understanding of the risk, and then move organizations to focusing on those areas where the risks are higher. So a particular component of a client base might be really low risk, and then you can support simplified due diligence, and you'll have a basis on which to say with some confidence that your risk responses are appropriate or proportionate in your circumstances. In broad terms, it's taking into account, as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen or the right, the 4 factors, or there's an other factor there as well, which I quite like. We haven't used it in our projects, but it relates to financial crime in the broader context and financial inclusion. So your other at the bottom is about the likes of fraud or the broader context of financial crime. And then product risk, delivery channel risk, client risk, and geographic risk. And you can take them in combination to produce an understanding at one of 2 levels, either at the overall organizational level for a client base, for example, or at an individual client level. So there's a macro or micro risk assessment and risk response opportunity. So your evaluation would be the rating in relation to those 5 factors, if you include other, and then weighting them according to their level of importance and producing an outcome. So you are, in this particular example, using you are multiplying the rating in respect of a weighting and taking an overall combination. So it's called a risk matrix. This is a really simple view of it, but it works quite well. And you can do it, as we were saying earlier, at an individual client level or at an overall client book level, or you can stratify your client base or categorize your client base in different categories and rate each of those categories differently. So your overall risk rating would then be categorized as we spoke about, so it can range from very high through to very low. We've used a 5-point rating scale, as I was alluding to earlier, in our models, but in some cases we've been asked to convert that into a high, medium, and low, so 3-point rating scale. I'm not an advocate of 3-point rating scales because there's not enough graduation. So for example, if you have a risk that is beyond your risk appetite, how do you rate it? Then it's a very high version of high risk, and what you're indicating, I think, is just high, medium, and low, standard due diligence, simplified due diligence, and higher levels of due diligence in an enhanced manner. It's better to have a more graduated approach. So when the risk assessment results in an outcome that is beyond your risk appetite, you would want to exit certain clients or certain types of business or certain categories, not de-risking, but on the basis of risk, data-driven. I've got a short example to illustrate this. If you had an overall client base that is rated as lower risk, and we've seen in our practical examples in risk rating client bases, sometimes remittances, the people that make use of the remittance, so the sender and then the receiver in the receiving country, they are populations of people that are sending money home to their families, and the context of that is family remittance, and the purpose behind the remittance and the context and the amount of it, and all of the data points you can put together can indicate lower risk in the majority of the transactions relating to those clients. So I think the days of automatically treating remittances as higher risk without reference to the data and assessment of the data points, those days have passed us by, and we should now have more robust approaches to be able to, with confidence, be able to represent that you've got proportionate responses to those risks. So you can see on the left-hand side, you've got a set of risk ratings: lower, medium, and we're not going to rate other risk on a 5-point scale and weighted according to the weights you can see there. The overall calculation would come out as lower risk. So with a lower risk client base, without particularly high geographic risks, so you might have a corridor, Senegal to a neighboring country, and both countries may come out as a lower risk context. Your overall lower risk, you now have a basis on which to assess the risk, and this is a classification table you can see at the bottom, which we've used. It's really simple, but it at least provides you a basis on which to have an overarching positioning. I'll show you a more detailed version of this just now, but this is the concept on which we're building our discussion. So let's have a look at that. You need risk rating at 2 levels. The first is at a macro business level for your organization. And what does that mean? So across the products, the delivery of those products, and the client base, you will have a number of things you want to take into account in respect of each of those factors. this is just an example you can see of the screen in relation to the risk assessment in relation to one factor, and that's product risk. You would do a similar thing to this at a business, overall business level, in respect of delivery channel, client, and geographic. So you would typically need a minimum of 4 sheets that look like this. The benefit of a model like this is that on a page or two, you can understand the attributes relating to the factor. You can have a conversation written up in various columns, and it can be used to engage with your senior management and the organization so they can take responsibility for the risk profile. And you can present this to your board of directors so they can understand that the macro, this is a macro level model, the macro level understanding of your 4 factors taken together. In this model, I'm going to go through this quite quickly. That's a nice simple model to use, but we find that...
John, if I may interrupt you a second for a question.
Sure, pleasure.
En fait, je pense que l'approche est très sophistiquée et structurée.
This approach is extremely sophisticated and very structured and very precise. Can you just give us an example about how a remittance service provider can actually use this table by giving us a concrete example, if possible? Thank you.
Happy to talk you through that. Thank you. I think first and foremost, this is a model that is done periodically. So it's not a dynamic transactions real-time perspective, but you need to understand the risk rating of your product. So periodically, normally the compliance person would facilitate management's understanding of the attributes you can see on the left-hand side of the screen. And your first part of it passes it. It might be perception driven. I often find that, especially in the examples we've been talking about, the organization says, well, we think that, for example, let's take item 4, which is cash funding. We think that there's some cash deposited in terms of what the sender is going to send, and that facilitates cash transactions, and it might be a thing that influences your thought about risk. The next iteration of this would be consideration of data. So you could have the proportion of cash, the context of that cash, the amount of it, and take other data points into account to be able to inform the model. So the way you use this model is a facilitated workshop format, and you would need to keep it up to date. Let me go through each of the headings to give you a sense of how you do that. The inherent risk is the factors the attributes you take into account, the inherent features of the product that might introduce money laundering risk or not. If you have a remittance product and there's a transaction limit on it, that obviously from an inherent risk point of view reduces the risk of the product. And you would, if you understood the data profile of that particular transaction over a period, so let's say over a year, over a month, whatever the sample is, you could determine the level of transactions, the volume of the transactions in terms of size and periodicity, and then be able to inform the risk decision. So you're writing up, and it can be quite nice, write up, don't over engineer it, just put a short description into the column that you can see. The inherent risk column is a description. The weighting is the level of importance. So in this example, cash funding and cash conversion is the majority of the weightings here. They are more important than the other items in this one. This is just a view. So another accountable institution might be not applicable and there's no weighting there. Your risk mitigation is the likes of due diligence. There's controlled effectiveness rating. So in this case, you've got a partially effective. So let's say your client anonymity is a risk. You say, yes, it's applicable. The inherent risk is medium because you've got quite good due diligence built into the system. You've got digital identification of your client, for example, in in a platform that facilitates digital onboarding and the likes. Your risk mitigation, you might say, is partially effective. You're going to have lower risk depending on how you calibrate the model. And you would then be able to say yes and no, just running through each of how to fill in the model. You choose from a drop-down menu a risk approach. You have a nice write-up in the column that I've got in the so it's the column heading use drop-down menu. That is your high, medium, and low. Your capture of the narrative I was talking about is in the column that's just that is to the left of the percentage. Your risk mitigation is also an opportunity to have a write-up so that anybody that reads this document, whether it be executive management or your board, can understand the overarching business risk assessment. The model automatically classifies the residual risk. So if you take medium risk with partially effective, at the moment it is designed to produce an outcome you can see. And then on the right-hand side, you've got an opportunity to use this model as an action sheet. So if there are any actions that you would like to put in place relating to risk mitigation, you would write them up there. In the end of the day, the model must be representative of the risk. So the narrative is important, and it's not all about numbers and the methodology that you use. I'd just like to leave you with a question in this regard. Are your risk assessment models more perception-driven or data-driven? In the interventions I was talking about, we found that very often risk assessment, money laundering risk, terrorist financing risk is often perception-driven. And there is such an opportunity to move towards more data-driven, assurance understood outcomes in the risk assessment model. Here's a further practical example of the model for you. Each one of the attributes I was talking about. So for example, transaction amount. You could have a calibrated risk assessment scale for that. These are dollars you can see on the left-hand side. Let's say you have a transaction size of $1,000. That's obviously going to be a rating of a 4, so it's a relatively higher risk, a higher end risk categorization in this scale. You might weight that as a certain weight. So I'm just drilling down into the model I showed you. I'm starting to move here in this model towards a transaction by transaction or client by client risk assessment basis. And I can talk very briefly to that. I won't spend too much time on it, but we have in the models we've been talking about an opportunity to move from high level overarching business risk assessment to consideration of individual transactions relating to clients that have a geographic context. And each of those attributes that I was showing you would have a risk rating. When you start thinking about data, so what are the data fields you need to take into account? We've analyzed the data files of clients anonymized so that we can get a feel for the transaction amount, transaction volume, sender, receiver, many to one, one to many, the country, the occupation, the nationality, the purpose of the remittance. And the reason I raise it is that quite often in a remittance world, you'll find an institution might say to you, but we can't afford to develop or buy or acquire really expensive systems. And I've got good news on that. You actually don't need that in some cases. You can, in a really short period of time, and that's what the Senfree project has been designed to do, move away from perception-driven due diligence to something that is a lot more data-driven. And the analysis we've undertaken takes into account some of these variables. And hopefully it's nice and practical on the screen. You can see the the things we've been using. And it doesn't take that long, and frankly, it's doable.
And how long should that take? Sorry, I will switch to French. Combien de temps justement
How
ça prend
long does it take
pour faire cette,
Okay.
cette analyse,
to
pour proposer
do that assessment
pour un prestataire de service, on va dire, classique?
in a sort of traditional framework?
Okay. Let me tell a story on this one. In one particular instance, exactly the discussion I was talking about was held. And so Senfree said, well, send us a data file. And the client agreed to send 3 months worth of transactions relating to their client base. So effectively, it was a flat file downloaded from their system and translated into Excel. And I think we received the file during the week. The following week, we provided the analysis. So we were able to provide them an understanding of the volume, then who sends data to whom. And within 1 week, I think we had done the entire analysis and went back to them a week later with the analysis, and that allows them to build a much more data-driven understanding. So it will not be a system that is real-time flagging transactions and giving the frontline staff an understanding of risk, but it moved the organization from very high-level responses to being able to home in on the risk. So if you had a customer base of, let's say, round numbers, it doesn't matter, it's 100 or let's say 10,000, and you can determine that of those 10,000, 9,500 are actually quite low risk. You can feed that back and have an understanding of what you need to do for due diligence. And if you've got 500 customers you need to spend more time on, it takes the focus away from over-engineering your due diligence in a legacy format. So yeah, if it happened, let's say within a month, we had all of that sorted. So we had a high-level business risk assessment undertaken. So we facilitated it for the client base, in a few 2-hour sessions, and then we helped them with the analysis. You do need somebody with data handling skills. If you don't have them, it'll be much harder.
Yeah, so that leads me to another question, John. Et désolé de vous challenger.
And so sorry to raise so many questions.
On veut profiter de votre expertise.
But we do want to make the most of your expertise. We know how well you know the subject. But once you've run that risk analysis, could you give us examples of how to adapt the customer identification processes?
Yeah, sure. In one of the organizations that we worked in, let's say you have a corridor, country 1 to country 2, without going into detail, and the one of the countries might be on the grey list, but if you can determine that the transaction profile fits the purpose for which the transaction is undertaken, and you can get a decent understanding of the client, you might have it's definitely not high risk because you're on the grey list. You might have a understanding or have a risk assessment relating to the sender country and the receiving country, but your transactions profile and client profile is actually quite low risk, and you can present that with some confidence, taking into account your analysis. It can be statistical if you go that way. You can then feed that into your due diligence, and then you might have in the past been requiring that a client provides you with address verification documentation. You now have a basis on which to say we're going to adopt a simplified due diligence approach, and you can show to a regulator or to yourselves. I mean, the reason you do the risk assessment is not always for the regulators. it's because the organization wants to mitigate risk, and it doesn't want to be associated with money laundering or terrorist financing. The example I was referring to had a particularly low risk terrorist financing context. So there was some risk relating to the country because it had a grey list standing, but the country itself didn't have a particularly high money terrorist financing risk, so you could assess that. So the overall example indicated that, let's say, 10% of the client base was higher risk, and about 0.5% was very high risk. You can then spend your time on those transactions. When that client transacts again, you might require additional information, and you're certainly going to monitor more often. So even if you're not buying expensive systems, you've got an analysis that can translate into where the compliance function and business should be focusing its attention. Our project didn't extend to actually analyzing that data, but that was the direction the organizations go in. So hopefully I've answered your question. It doesn't mean there's no risk, but you have a data-driven understanding that 80% of your clients are actually quite low risk. You can determine the purpose. The system will, the analysis will allow you to say that the transaction profile is consistent with that purpose. So if you're sending money home to your family, you might have one transaction per month, sometimes two transactions for a particular client. Another example might be that you have a sender sending 50 transactions over a 3-month period. That's not a retail profile. But in the past, it was missed by the organization because there wasn't a data analysis. The amounts involved weren't huge, and they weren't flagged as being higher risk. In this example, those accounts might not be financial malice at all, but they're certainly higher risk. And you can spend your time focusing on that. And when it becomes suspicious, you report those transactions as suspicious. And we were able to assist with that. With that framework. Hopefully it's quite a broad discussion, but hopefully I've provided, yeah.
Not sure that would deserve an entire COP to explain how a particular RSP has implemented the tool, I think. So I will let you finish your presentation, because I think you are close to the end. We are also close to the end of the workshop. So please go ahead. We'll try not to interrupt you anymore.
No, it's fine.
Yeah.
We did leave time for questions, so it's a real pleasure.
Yeah.
I've just got 2 slides, and I'm going to leave you with some questions here. In conclusion, do you need risk reporting, and what should you think about in that? The answer is a definite yes. And what should be reported and when and to whom? Your understanding of risk should be seen in relation to your risk appetite, and you need to develop risk tolerances, and that should be measurable. Once you have these models, and they are quite simple and deliberately simple, they're not overly sophisticated when you start using them. You do need to have data handling skills, but you should then report in relation to the data that we spoke about. And then I have a question for you. Your level of confidence that you've got your risk assessment right plays an important role. So you should be able to tell your audience that we're confident, or there's a level of assurance that we understand our risk and it's within our risk appetite. Let me leave you with that question. I think it's an important one, and it'll define and it articulates back into the starting point. What does success look like for you? If it's purely to comply, tick box with the law, yeah, peace. I mean, that's one way of looking at compliance. Our view is that it's broader than that, and you should articulate into not wanting to be close to financial crime. From my side, that's all I wanted to cover. I think I've covered the last slide as well. So many thanks for the opportunity to speak. Can I hand back? Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, John.
Thank you very much, John.
I would like to ask you one question referring to the norm 27,000 ISO, referring the risk assessment specifically, and also to know how, in terms of supervision and in terms of risk-based supervision, how can supervisors supervise within your risk-based approach?
Okay, we have a separate model for risk-based supervision, and we have implemented it in a country, and we've helped a further country as part of this project to implement risk-based supervision processes. And quite often when you get on the grey list, there's a need for this. And it does the same things, but it provides the supervisor with an understanding of the institution so that they can focus their supervisory attention on those organizations or those risks that are higher priority. It's quite a big discussion, but I'm sure Masiwa and the team would be happy to facilitate a discussion relating to that. It's a separate model. It's not the same models we've just spoken about, but it uses the same principles. I find that ISO standards are not terribly useful in developing frameworks for risk assessment. They don't cover AML, the operational risk context, which ISO standards are built around, are not ideal. You need to understand the factors we've spoken about, and those international standards, in my view, simply do not exist. I would be very happy to help anybody that is interested in starting a conversation around standards that are applicable in sub-Saharan Africa. I really think it's very, very needed. Yeah, thank you.
I would like also to
maybe we can close the presentation. John, if it's possible, just to close the presentation. There you go.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pedro. Okay, just recalling to your experience, in West Africa specifically, we are really struggling because we don't have a switch that could really link remittance corridor directly to mobile money. Please, could you just refer to your experience, share with us how could the central bank could access this and set up a toolkit to ease the integration of specifically MTO's processors. I'm talking about, for instance, tunes. I'm talking about, for instance, MFS that are linking remittance corridors directly to mobile money.
Yeah, indeed. We have had an instance where we provided assistance to an organization that has a wallet. So the remittance terminates into a wallet, and we help them think about how to assess risk. But how you can get hold of the models, I'm going to need to refer to my colleague Masiwa. And Masiwa, am I putting you on the spot if I refer back to you?
Yes, John. Regarding the linking of payment processors and remittance providers and MNOs to switch, that's the question. I think the issue there, what's important to understand and recognize is that across the different countries, the regulatory frameworks differ, but also differ as it relates to the payments terrain, mobile money, as well as the financial service providers. So I think what's key there is just to ensure that there is regulatory harmonization to ensure that what you're talking about, Leleng, there can be facilitated. Because in most cases, regulators do acquire the switches, but then the use cases are quite limited, and at times it's very difficult for other providers to integrate into those switches. So I think those are just some of the things that needs to be looked at, and it's just the whole, just the ecosystem, and what is the how can the different players be integrated into the ecosystem in light of the objectives that we want to promote. We want to promote access of financial services to the low income, poor majority, and everybody else. So I think those are just some of the things that needs to be addressed. And yeah, there are challenges across countries, across regions around those issues.
Ok, très bien. Merci.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, John, for your response and for your presentation. Thank you also, Nicola, for your interpretation and your presentation. Merci. Je voudrais aussi encourager tous les participants.
So thank you very much, and I would like to urge all the participants and also the COP in Senegal, the community of practice in Senegal, to continue to be present in our next meetings. You have probably noticed that we are trying to follow a directive. We're trying to follow the guidance that has been outlined. And I would also like to mention that we have a LinkedIn group that is dedicated to national remittance networks. And you can share your difficulties on this network if you wish. This working group is really dedicated to sharing of experience, so you can share experience and the difficulty encountered by the players in this field. Some MTOs have a few problems, and they may not be the same as the problems encountered by banks or by mobile money operators or by switches. So it is really a group which is aimed at sharing experience and sharing concerns. We also organize GFRID. We will organize a GFRID meeting on 7th of June in Nairobi. It is a very big event in international remittances, so I urge you to participate in it. The president of IFAD will also be present, and we address a lot of different issues related to remittances at that point, especially financial inclusion. And this is very important because all the central banks that are present there share their experience at that event. And I think that West Africa can make its contribution as well. So I urge you to participate in this event. And I have just shared the link, in fact, to participate in this event. If you wish, the link is in the chat of this Zoom meeting. So once again, I'd like to thank you for joining us. So before we end this session, I would just like to say hello to our friends. Hello since the last session. So I'm Pedro, de Vasconcelos. I am in charge of the program. So I just want to thank you for participating. And he referred to the GFRID, the Global Forum for Investment for Development. So there is this event that is going to be organized. It is really a very important event in remittances. I think it is the only event which brings together private sector, public sector, and civil society all together around the table. The last time it was in Asia in 2018. The 2020 edition was not in presence because of the COVID pandemic, of course. But Africa will really be on top of the agenda. We will know how to address all the different issues in Africa. The public sector will be there, and we will also have sessions on remittances, but also on the investments made by the diaspora. So I urge you to attend the GFRID meeting. It'll be from the 14th of this out to 16th of June. And I think that you have a link in this chat so that you have all the information on how to participate in this event. Now, this presentation that you heard today is quite complex. The forum will continue the discussion. We will go a lot more in detail on what you just heard today. So you will have more information on what to do and how to proceed at the local, regional, national levels. And as far as this presentation is concerned that you just heard, I urge everyone who has attended to ask questions. Please do send your questions, and our colleagues from Senfree will be very happy to answer your questions. So you can send your questions to us in the days to come. And I'll give the floor back for the conclusion of this session to Lelen. Thank you very much, Pedro. Thank you very much for having intervened. Once again, it is indeed a very important event, and I'm going to send you individually all the invitations that you can join this group that I mentioned, the LinkedIn dedicated group. And I'm also going to send you information on the GFRID forum. So once again, thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for participating and showing interest.
And thank you to Senfree team. Bye.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.
Hello.